Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to tackle, well, a really fundamental question. What exactly is the core message of the Christian gospel?
Right. And we're using this source, Imara chapter 2, to kind of unpack that.
Exactly. We want to get a clear handle on its main points, extract the essential building blocks so we can really understand what it's driving at.
Yeah, the goal is clarity. We'll look at how this text describes God, then humanity's relationship to God.
And then the role of Jesus Christ in bridging that gap.
Precisely. And it's worth noting, this source does keep Muslim perspectives in mind as it goes through these points.
Okay, good to know. So first up, the source defines gospel.
It breaks it down. Literally good news from the Greek, euangelion.
Right, and it says, wow, okay, sometimes it means the whole Bible.
Yeah, broadly speaking.
Its tighter focus is on Jesus Christ and salvation. But here's a really key idea it brings up right away.
What's that?
It basically says God is the gospel. That's quite a statement to start with.
It really is. And the source argues, well, if God is the good news, then you've got to understand God's nature first to really get the message.
Makes sense.
So it lays out 5 core attributes of God that it sees as essential.
Okay, let's walk through those. The first one is God's eternality.
Yeah, no beginning, no end. It points to Genesis 1.1, in the beginning, God. And Psalm 90.2, from everlasting to everlasting.
And it connects this to God calling himself, I am Yahweh or Jehovah back in Exodus.
Exactly, Exodus 3.12. And it even links that to Jesus saying, before Abraham was born, I am in John's gospel.
Interesting. And the text points out that actually all Abrahamic faiths agree God is eternal.
That's a key point of common ground. So from eternality, it moves to God's holiness.
Holiness, meaning?
Meaning totally unique, set apart from creation, absolutely without sin. It pulls in verses like Isaiah 6.3, Habakkuk 1.13.
To really hammer home this idea of God being fundamentally different, pure.
Right. Utterly separate from any imperfection.
Right. And that purity, that holiness, it kind of leads naturally to the next attribute, doesn't it? God's justice.
It does. The source explains God's justice means he always acts rightly, shows no favoritism like in Acts 10.34.
And crucially, that justice demands consequences for wrongdoing. It cites 2 Thessalonians and Colossians on that.
Yes, because if you have a perfect standard holiness, then any deviation, well, it has to be addressed justly.
Okay, so God is eternal, holy, just. But then comes mercy. How does that fit in?
That's the vital question, isn't it? The text defines mercy as God choosing not to give the punishment that's actually deserved.
So withholding what's due.
Exactly. It gives examples like with David's line in Kings or God's compassion in the Psalms. Even the Day of Atonement in Leviticus is used as an illustration.
So how can a perfectly just God also be merciful? That seems like a tension.
And the source finds the resolution in the final attribute it highlights. God is love.
Not just that he shows love, but he is love.
Right. 1 John 4.8, God is love. And it brings in 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter.
And this is where that word propitiation comes up.
Yeah.
From 1 John 4.10.
Yes. The source explains propitiation as the way God's justice gets satisfied. Think of it like a debt being paid.
Okay.
Once the debt is paid, the creditor is free to show kindness, right? So propitiation deals with the justice requirement, clearing the way for mercy.
Because of God's love.
Exactly. And it stresses this love is unconditional, pointing to Romans 5.8, God loving us while we were still sinners, and John 15.13.
Wow. Okay, so those 5 attributes, eternal, holy, just, merciful, loving, they work together in this framework.
They really do. Justice demands sin be addressed, but love provides the way propitiation so mercy can be shown without compromising that justice. It's quite a picture.
It is. So after laying out God's nature, the text then shifts focus right to knowing man's nature.
It does, and it's quite a contrast.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Instead of eternal, holy, just, humanity is described as temporary, sinful, corrupted, even revengeful.
It traces this back to Adam using Romans 5.12 and Psalm 51, suggesting sin leads to this inherent lack of desire for true good. Romans 7.18, Titus 1.15 are mentioned there.
And how does it define sin itself?
Pretty simply, actually, as missing the mark, failing to meet God's perfect standard, his law. Romans 3.23, all have sinned.
And that law, God's standard, it's also described as perfect, right? Eternal, holy, just.
Exactly. Romans 7.12, Psalm 111, the 10 Commandments are given as a kind of summary of that standard.
So the law isn't bad, but its effect is Well, it shows us where we fail.
Precisely. The source says the law reveals sin. Like you said, it's like an X-ray showing the break. Romans 3.1920, Romans 7.711 touch on this.
And it tackles excuses, too, saying even seemingly small sins matter.
Yes, because the standard is God's perfect holiness and justice. James 2.10 show has cited breaking one part makes you guilty of all.
It also contrasts how we judge looking at the outside versus God looking at the heart.
Right. 1 Samuel 16.7. And it brings in Jesus' teachings, anger being like murder in the heart, lust like adultery, Matthew 5. It goes much deeper than just actions.
So the standard is incredibly high, internally high.
Very. The source then describes sin as a kind of bondage. John 8.34, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Our own evil desires control us. Genesis 6.5, Jeremiah 17.9.
So even our good deeds, they can't fix this.
According to the source, no. Because they come from that flawed, sinful nature, Isaiah 64.6, filthy rags. Even our best efforts are tainted.
Okay. And because God is just, sin needs punishment. And because God is eternal.
The consequence is eternal. That's the stark conclusion the text draws. It points to Matthew 25.46, 2 Thessalonians 1.9 Revelation passages, eternal separation and punishment.
So we're presented with this huge problem. Holy, just God. Sinful humanity facing eternal consequences. It feels impossible.
It sets up that exact feeling, which leads directly to the core question, is there any solution? Any hope?
And that's where Jesus comes in, knowing the God-man Jesus Christ.
Exactly. He's presented as the answer. And his nature, fully God and fully man, is key.
Why both?
Well, the source explains. His humanity meant he could represent us, stand in our place. His divinity meant he could fully represent God and, crucially, offer a sacrifice of infinite value.
Okay, so the text highlights key things about his life.
It does, starting with the virgin birth, Matthew 1, Luke 1. Seen as signifying his divine nature, Son of God, but also his real humanity, born of Mary.
And then his sinlessness. That's huge, right?
Absolutely critical. Lived as a human, tempted like us, yet without sin. Hebrews 4.15, 1 Peter 2.22. This made him the perfect sacrifice, the lamb without blemish, referencing 1 Peter 1.12.
So he lived perfectly, then, his death.
Yes, and the source is careful here. It says he didn't stop being God, but he emptied himself, took on limitations, Philippians 2 tells us, to be able to die for humanity.
Connecting back to death entering through sin from Romans 5.
Right. The analogy used is like an adult letting a child win a game, a voluntary setting aside of advantage, not a loss of fundamental nature.
Okay. Lived perfectly, died sacrificially, and then the resurrection.
The absolute turning point, highlighted as the victory over sin and death, John 2.19, John 11.25.
And it emphasizes Jesus' own claims about himself, things that only God could really claim.
Yes. I am the way, the truth, and the life, John 14.6. Before Abraham was, I am, John 8.58, echoing God's name. I and the Father are one, John 10.30.
Plus the fact that people worshipped him and he forgave sins, things reserved for God in the Old Testament.
Exactly. Matthew 28.9, Luke 5.20. It all points to his divine identity.
So the argument is, his death paid the penalty for sin.
Fully paid it, satisfying God's justice.
And his resurrection proved God the Father accepted that payment.
That's the core. 1 Corinthians 15.3-4 sums it up. And the result, victory over sin and death, as Paul writes later in that chapter.
So the main message is, Jesus came to save people from their sin, its penalty, and its power.
Yes, freedom through his death and resurrection. The source lists many scriptures emphasizing this sacrifice, Isaiah 53, Psalm 22, John 1.29, 1 Peter 2.24, and so on.
Now, you mentioned this source also brings in comparisons with Islam.
It does, in a specific section. It acknowledges common ground first. Muslims also believe God, Allah, is eternal, holy, just, merciful.
But then it raises questions, points of difference.
Yes, from its perspective. It points to a verse in the Quran, 48.1, suggesting God's forgiveness might seem arbitrary, and questions how that fits with perfect justice.
Okay.
It also contrasts the view of sin. The source emphasizes inherent human sinfulness, while it suggests the Quranic view in the Adam and Eve story leans more towards ignorance or deception being the primary issue.
And the view of Jesus.
The source notes the Muslim view of Jesus as a revered prophet bringing guidance, the Sharia, contrasting that with the Christian view of Jesus as the divine savior who is the way, not just showing the way.
Got it. So it's definitely presenting a particular theological comparison there.
Clearly. It's aiming to highlight the distinctives of the Christian message as presented in the chapter.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. Based on our deep dive into this chapter of Imara, the core Christian gospel message, as laid out here, really depends on understanding first God's complex nature, eternal, holy, just, loving, merciful.
Right. Those 5 attributes working together.
Then understanding humanity's situation, fundamentally sinful, falling short of God's standard, and facing eternal consequences because of God's justice.
That stark reality.
And finally, seeing Jesus Christ, fully God, fully man, his sinless life, his sacrificial death, and his resurrection as the unique, divinely provided solution that satisfies God's justice and offers mercy and rescue.
That's the essence of it, yes.
Yep.
Life, death, resurrection as the bridge.
And as we discussed, the source contrasts this framework with its understanding of certain Islamic theological points, asking you, the reader or listener, to weigh those differences.
Definitely encourages that reflection.
So it leaves us with something to think about, doesn't it? Given these really profound claims about God, about us, about Jesus,
Yeah.
what does that mean for how you understand, well, your own life and relationship with God?
Yeah, what parts of this exploration really stand out to you? What resonates? Or maybe what further questions does it spark? Something to definitely mull over.